The air in Panjim carried the scent of salt and spices, a blend of Arabian sea mist and the turmeric that clung to every corner of the Goan markets. This small coastal city, with its Portuguese-era cathedrals and pastel-colored colonial homes, existed in a peculiar time warp where East met West, where Catholic bells chimed over the muezzin's call, and where tradition weighed heavier than the humid monsoon air. For Camille Laurent, a 38-year-old widow with French ancestry, traced back 4 generations to Indo-Portuguese trading families, Panjim was both sanctuary and prison. Every morning began the same way. Camille would wake before dawn, her fingers automatically reaching for the rosary beads on her nightstand, a habit so ingrained it required no conscious thought. She would pray in the darkness of her bedroom, the words flowing in a mixture of Konkani and Portuguese, languages her grandmother had insisted she learn despite the family's French surname. Her husband Thomas had been dead for 2 years now, a sudden heart attack that took him at 43, leaving her with 2 teenage daughters and a sprawling ancestral home that felt emptier with each passing month. The community knew Camille as the embodiment of Catholic virtue. She attended daily Mass at Our Lady of Immaculate Conception, the Baroque church that dominated Panjim's skyline with its twin towers and grand staircase. Her daughters, Adele and Jeanne, both 15 and 17, were altar servers, youth group leaders, and regular volunteers at the parish charity drives. Camille herself organized the annual feast preparations, managed the choir schedule, and coordinated the catechism classes for younger children. To the outside world, she was a woman who had transformed her grief into devotion, who had found solace in service to God after losing her husband. But beneath this carefully maintained exterior, Camille was drowning. The nights were the worst, when the house fell silent except for the rhythmic crash of waves from the nearby beach. She would lie awake, staring at the ceiling fan that spun lazily overhead, and feel the weight of her loneliness pressing down on her chest like a physical force. Thomas had been her childhood sweetheart, the boy from the neighboring Catholic family who had courted her with poems written in French and gifts of jasmine flowers. Their marriage had been the social event of the season, uniting 2 prominent Goan Catholic families with impeccable lineage. What the community didn't know, what Camille herself barely admitted in the darkest hours of night, was that her marriage had been slowly dying long before Thomas's heart gave out. He had grown distant, absorbed in his import-export business, traveling constantly between Goa and Mumbai, and when he was home he was either exhausted or irritable. The tenderness of their early years had evaporated, replaced by polite coexistence and separate bedrooms. His death had been tragic, yes, but it had also been a strange kind of relief, a thought that filled Camille with such crushing guilt she could barely breathe when it surfaced. Father Gabriel Moreau arrived at the parish 18 months ago, transferred from a seminary in Mangalore where he had spent the previous decade teaching theology. At 45, he was younger than most of the clergy in Goa, his face still unlined despite the silver threading through his dark hair. He was the son of a French missionary father and a Keralite mother, raised between 2 worlds, fluent in 5 languages and possessed of a charisma that drew people to him effortlessly. His sermons were intellectual yet accessible, weaving together scripture, poetry, and contemporary social issues. He spoke openly about mental health, about the importance of emotional honesty, about the need for the church to evolve with the times while maintaining its sacred traditions. The parishioners loved him immediately. The older women brought him homemade bebinka and prawn balchon, fussing over whether he was eating enough. The men respected his theological knowledge and his willingness to engage in lengthy discussions about faith and doubt. The young people found in him a priest who actually listened, who didn't dismiss their struggles with rigid doctrine, but helped them navigate their questions with compassion. Father Gabriel, everyone agreed, was exactly what the parish needed. Camille first truly noticed him during a parish council meeting about the upcoming Christmas celebrations. She had been presenting her ideas for the nativity play when he had asked a question that showed he had been genuinely listening, not just waiting for his turn to speak. His eyes, a striking hazel that seemed to shift between green and gold, depending on the light, had held hers for a moment longer than necessary. She had felt something stir inside her, something she hadn't felt in years, perhaps had never truly felt with Thomas. It was recognition, the sudden understanding that here was someone who might actually see her, not as the perfect widow, not as the dutiful mother, but as Camille, a woman with desires and fears and dreams she had buried so deep she sometimes forgot they existed. The Goan Catholic community operated on unspoken rules that everyone understood. Reputation was everything, more valuable than money, more enduring than property. A family's standing could be destroyed by a single scandal, gossip spreading through the tightly knit neighborhoods with the speed and ferocity of monsoon floods. Camille had lived her entire life under the weight of these expectations, had absorbed them with her mother's milk, had passed them on to her daughters without question. The Laurent name meant something in Panjim. It meant respectability, piety, unimpeachable moral standing. When Camille began seeking out Father Gabriel for spiritual guidance, it seemed natural, even admirable. A widow processing her grief, a mother concerned about raising her daughters in an increasingly secular world, a faithful parishioner wanting to deepen her relationship with God. These were the reasons she gave to the parish secretary when scheduling appointments, to her daughters when she left the house for evening consultations, to herself when doubt crept in during sleepless nights. Their first few meetings were exactly what they appeared to be on the surface. Camille would sit in the simple consultation room adjacent to the sacristy, hands folded in her lap, and talk about Thomas, about the unexpected relief mixed with her grief, about the guilt that consumed her for feeling anything other than pure sorrow. Father Gabriel listened without judgment, his responses thoughtful and measured. He spoke about the complexity of human emotion, about how love and frustration could coexist in a marriage, about how grief wasn't linear or simple, but a tangled mess of contradictory feelings that didn't fit neatly into the narratives we tell ourselves and others. In their fourth meeting, something shifted. Camille had been talking about loneliness, about waking up in the middle of the night and feeling like she was floating in an infinite void, untethered from anything solid or real. Her voice had cracked, tears finally breaking through the composed facade she worked so hard to maintain. Father Gabriel had reached across the small table between them, his hand covering hers, warm and solid and real. The touch had lasted only seconds, but it had sent electricity coursing through her entire body, a jolt of awareness so intense it left her breathless. Neither of them acknowledged what had happened. The session had continued, his hand returning to his side, her composure gradually reassembling itself. But something fundamental had changed. The air between them felt charged now, heavy with possibility and danger. Camille walked home that evening in a daze, the Goan streets she had known her entire life suddenly feeling foreign and dreamlike. She told herself it meant nothing, that she had been vulnerable and he had offered comfort, that she was reading significance into a simple gesture of pastoral care. But she knew. Deep in her bones, in the part of herself she had spent decades suppressing, she knew. This was the beginning of something that would change everything, that would unravel the carefully constructed life she had built, that would reveal the woman she had always been beneath the layers of duty and expectation. The woman who wanted more than prayers and propriety, who craved passion and genuine connection, who was tired of performing virtue while feeling hollowed out inside. Father Gabriel, for his part, was equally aware of the dangerous current now flowing between them. He had dedicated 25 years to his vocation, had taken vows that he believed in with every fibre of his being. He had counseled countless women through grief and doubt, had maintained professional boundaries with ease, had never once been tempted to cross the line that separated priest from parishioner, spiritual guide from man. But Camille was different. Her intelligence, her carefully hidden pain, the glimpses of fierce longing he saw beneath her composed exterior, all of it called to something in him he thought he had successfully buried when he entered the seminary at 20. The Goan monsoon season was approaching, the air growing heavier each day with the promise of rain. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, and everyone in Panjim knew that when the storms finally broke, they would be fierce and unrelenting. Neither Camille nor Father Gabriel understood yet that the meteorological storm building over the Arabian Sea was nothing compared to the tempest they were about to unleash on their lives, their community, and everyone they loved. The progression happened in increments so small that neither Camille nor Father Gabriel could pinpoint the exact moment pastoral care became something else entirely. Their weekly meetings continued, scheduled officially in the parish calendar as spiritual direction sessions. The parish secretary, Mrs. D'Souza, who had known Camille since childhood, saw nothing unusual in a grieving widow seeking regular counsel from their new priest. By the fifth meeting, they had abandoned the formal consultation room for the church garden, a quiet space behind the sacristy where frangipani trees provided shade and traffic sounds faded to a distant hum. Neither acknowledged that the garden offered privacy, that the stone benches beneath flowering trees created an intimacy impossible in the sterile consultation room with its ever-present crucifix watching from the wall. Their conversations evolved beyond faith and loss. Father Gabriel spoke about his childhood split between his French father's rigid discipline and his Malayali mother's warm emotionality, never quite belonging to either culture. He described the loneliness of the seminary, the years of suppressing natural desires. Camille shared things she had never told anyone, not her mother, not Thomas. She talked about feeling invisible in her own marriage, about abandoning her dreams of writing when she married at 22. The Goan heat intensified as May approached, humidity turning the air thick as soup. Camille began wearing lighter cotton salwar kameez that clung to her skin. She noticed how Father Gabriel's eyes would sometimes drift to the hollow of her throat where perspiration collected, how he would quickly look away, jaw tightening. She noticed because she was watching him too, the way his collar seemed to constrict his breathing on hot days, the strength in his hands when he gestured while speaking. Their sixth meeting lasted 3 hours, talking until evening shadows stretched long across the garden. When they finally stood to leave, there was awkwardness, both aware something unspoken had shifted. As she passed through the garden gate, his hand brushed her arm, lingering a fraction too long. The touch burned through the thin cotton, and heat flooded Camille's face that had nothing to do with the tropical climate. At home, Adele noticed her mother seemed happier, lighter. Camille's mother remarked that the spiritual guidance was clearly beneficial, that Camille had the glow of someone finding peace with God's plan. The irony wasn't lost on Camille, who was finding peace through increasingly worldly feelings for a man who had sworn celibacy. Father Gabriel fought his own battle. He increased his prayer schedule, adding extra hours in the chapel, performed additional penances, even considered requesting a transfer. But the thought of not seeing Camille filled him with desperation that terrified him. 25 years of identity built around priesthood suddenly seemed like chains rather than liberation. The 7th meeting changed everything. Heavy rain forced them indoors, the monsoon arriving early with characteristic violence. Thunder rolled across Panjim and power knocked out across the neighborhood, plunging them into darkness broken only by lightning flashes. In the enclosed space, with rain hammering windows and wet earth smell flooding through cracks, the tension became unbearable. Camille was talking about fear, about being afraid to want things that didn't fit the narrative of grieving widow, devoted mother, faithful Catholic. Father Gabriel had moved closer to hear her over the storm. In a bright lightning flash, their eyes met. Neither could look away. The air felt electric, charged with something more powerful than the storm outside. His hand cupped her face, thumb tracing her cheekbone, and she leaned into the touch like someone starving. The kiss, when it came, was inevitable and devastating. It lasted only seconds before they pulled apart, both breathing hard, shocked. They sat in stunned silence as the storm continued, as everything they had built their lives around crumbled. 3 days passed with no contact. Father Gabriel seemed to look through her at Mass, his face a mask of professional distance. But on the 4th day, she received a text from an unknown number, the church garden, 9 tonight. She knew who it was and what it meant. She should have ignored it. Instead, she counted the hours. The garden was dark except for moonlight through the frangipani trees. Father Gabriel stood with his back to her, shoulders tense. When he turned, anguish was written across his face. They needed to establish boundaries, he said. Ensure it never happened again. But even as he spoke, he was moving toward her. Their second kiss was longer, deeper, desperate with weeks of suppressed longing. They met again 2 nights later, then 3 nights after that. Each time they told themselves it would be the last. Each time they ended up in each other's arms, boundaries dissolving. They were careful, meeting only after dark in secluded locations, a beach beyond tourist areas where waves covered their voices. Father Gabriel stopped wearing his clerical collar, trying to separate priest from man, though both knew this distinction was meaningless. By their 10th meeting, in a rented room in Margao far enough to ensure anonymity, they crossed the final boundary. Camille had told her daughters she was visiting a distant cousin. Father Gabriel had informed the bishop he was conducting rural outreach. The lies came easier now. For those few hours, Camille felt more alive than in her entire marriage. For Father Gabriel, it was surrender and defeat and revelation all at once. Afterward, lying in tangled sheets, reality crashed back. Father Gabriel wept, and Camille held him, her own tears silent. They had destroyed everything, violated sacred vows, betrayed their community, their God, themselves. But they knew they would do it again. The affair had progressed beyond their control, pulled toward an ending neither could imagine, but both sensed would be catastrophic. 3 months into the affair, Camille had become an expert at deception. She maintained separate calendars, one visible showing parish activities, another password-protected detailing meetings with Gabriel. She had opened a secret bank account using insurance money to pay for hotel rooms in coastal towns where no one would recognize them. The careful woman who once agonized over white lies now constructed elaborate fictions with disturbing ease. The lies to her daughters were hardest. Adele had started asking questions, her 15-year-old instincts sensing something wrong. Why was her mother gone so many evenings? Why the constant phone checking with that particular expression, half guilt and half anticipation? Camille deflected with invented church committees, charity work in neighboring villages, prayer groups that ran late. Jeanne, consumed by entrance exams, accepted these explanations, but Adele watched with increasingly suspicious eyes. Gabriel's transformation was equally dramatic. The priest known for his availability suddenly became elusive. He cancelled counseling sessions, delegated parish responsibilities, spent long hours allegedly visiting the sick in far-flung villages. The parish council attributed it to burnout, suggested a proper vacation. He promised to consider it while planning his next rendezvous with Camille. They had purchased second phones, cheap devices kept hidden, used exclusively for their relationship. They disposed of SIM cards every few weeks, maintaining the fantasy they could contain the affair, keep it separate from their real lives. But affairs, like fires, don't respect boundaries. The Goan Catholic community operated on a network of watchers, neighbors who monitored each other not from malice but from genuine belief in collective moral responsibility. Camille and Gabriel thought they were being careful, meeting in distant towns, using cash, maintaining professional distance in public. But they had underestimated how thoroughly their lives were observed. Mrs. Pereira mentioned to Mrs. D'Souza that she had seen someone remarkably like Camille Laurent in Margao, emerging from a hotel with a man who wasn't from their parish. Mrs. D'Souza dismissed it as mistaken identity, but the seed was planted, and in community gossip, seeds grew quickly. Rohan Desai entered the picture in July, arriving at the Laurent home with flowers and a formal request to court Camille. He was a widower, 52, a successful pharmaceutical distributor. His wife had died 3 years earlier, and after appropriate mourning, his family encouraged him to remarry. Someone had suggested Camille, a respectable widow from a good family. In traditional Goan Catholic society, such arrangements were still common. Camille's mother was thrilled. She invited Rohan for dinner without consulting her daughter, orchestrating an elaborate meal. Camille sat through the evening in barely controlled panic, making polite conversation while her mind raced. Rohan was perfectly pleasant, educated, financially secure, exactly the match her community would approve. After he left, Camille's mother was effusive. Such a good man, such excellent prospects. This was God's provision, his plan for Camille to have companionship again. She had already begun mentally planning the wedding. Camille felt the walls closing in. She couldn't tell her mother about Gabriel without destroying everything, but she couldn't imagine marrying Rohan while her heart belonged to someone else. That night, she texted Gabriel, "We need to talk. Tomorrow. It's urgent." They met at their usual spot near Aguada Fort, overlooking the Arabian Sea. When Camille told him about Rohan's proposal, about her mother's expectations, about the pressure mounting from all sides, Gabriel listened in silence. Then he said the words that would seal both their fates. "Leave with me. We'll go somewhere no one knows us. Start over." The proposal was insane. Gabriel would abandon his priesthood, everything he had dedicated his life to. Camille would have to leave her daughters, at least temporarily. They would be cut off from families, communities, labeled as sinners and adulterers. It was madness. But sitting there watching the sunset, with Gabriel's hand in hers, Camille found herself considering it. The alternative was a lifetime of regret, of suffocating under duty and expectation. She thought about her marriage to Thomas, the slow death of possibility. She couldn't do it again. They made a plan that night. Gabriel would request a leave of absence citing health concerns. Camille would tell her family she was going on a pilgrimage. They would meet in Bangalore, a city large enough to disappear in, and from there decide their next steps. Gabriel would leave first, Camille 2 weeks later after arranging for her daughters to stay with her mother. But fate had other plans. Adele had been watching more carefully than Camille realized. That night, unable to sleep, troubled by tension in the house, Adele crept downstairs and found her mother's purse. Inside was the second phone. Adele scrolled through messages that made her stomach turn, words of love between her mother and someone saved as G in the contacts. The 15-year-old sat in the dark kitchen, her worldview shattering. Her mother was having an affair with Father Gabriel because who else could G be? The betrayal cut deep, not just of her father's memory, but of everything Adele had been taught to believe about morality, family, faith. She should have confronted her mother immediately. Instead, Adele did something that would have devastating consequences. She went to the assistant pastor, Father Joseph, who had baptized her as an infant, and through tears told him everything she had discovered. Father Joseph listened with growing horror. A priest breaking his vows was serious enough, but with a prominent parishioner, a widow with children, the implications were catastrophic. He told Adele to say nothing to anyone else. Then he informed the bishop. The bishop understood immediately that this required careful management. Scandals destroyed parishes, undermined faith. He summoned Gabriel to the diocesan office under pretense of a routine meeting. Gabriel went unsuspecting, his mind occupied with plans for Bangalore, thoughts of the future he and Camille were building. The confrontation was brutal. The bishop laid out what he knew, the meetings, the suspicious absences, the testimony of a troubled teenager. He didn't ask if it was true. The guilt was written on Gabriel's face. Instead, he asked what Gabriel intended to do. Was he prepared to end this immediately and recommit to his vows, or would he choose a different path? Gabriel sat in stunned silence, his plans disintegrating. Someone knew. Multiple people knew. In that moment, faced with the bishop's stern judgment and the weight of his broken vows, Gabriel made a decision he thought was protective. He would end it. He would tell Camille it was over, that they had been foolish. He would accept whatever punishment the church deemed appropriate. But when he texted Camille that evening to arrange a meeting, he had no way of knowing that other forces had already been set in motion, that Rohan Desai had decided to press his suit more aggressively, or that Mrs. Pereira had finally remembered where she had seen that couple in Margao and had shared this information with several friends, now watching Camille's movements with hawkish attention. And he certainly didn't know that in trying to end the affair to protect everyone involved, he was actually lighting the fuse on an explosive situation that would end not in quiet resignation, but in violence, death, and the complete destruction of multiple lives. Gabriel chose the church garden for what he intended to be their final meeting, perhaps hoping the sacred space would give him strength. Camille arrived 15 minutes early, heart racing, assuming his urgent tone meant they were accelerating their escape plans. She wore a simple white kurta, her hair loose the way Gabriel had once said he loved. She had no idea she was dressed for a funeral, the death of the future she had allowed herself to imagine. He was already there, standing beneath the frangipani tree where they had shared their first real conversation. But his posture was different now, closed off, arms crossed like armor. When he turned to face her, she saw something in his eyes that made her stomach drop, a finality that needed no words. Gabriel spoke carefully, each word measured. The bishop knew, Adele knew, others suspected. He had taken vows, sacred promises before God that he had broken. She had daughters who needed her, a family reputation to protect. What they had done was wrong, and it needed to end immediately. He would be transferring to a monastery in Gokana within the week. She should accept Rohan's proposal, build a stable life, forget this ever happened. Camille listened in growing disbelief. Forget this ever happened. As if the past 3 months had been some trivial dalliance, as if she hadn't already burned her entire life to the ground in preparation for their escape. She felt rage building, hot and unfamiliar, a fury she had suppressed her entire life in service of being good. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was low and dangerous. He didn't get to make this decision unilaterally, didn't get to use her as his spiritual experiment and then discard her when guilt became inconvenient. He had promised her a future, had made her believe she deserved more than a life of duty and sacrifice. And now, at the first sign of real consequence, he was retreating back to the safety of his collar and his vows. The argument escalated, voices rising in the garden that had once been their sanctuary. Gabriel pleaded for her to understand, to think of her daughters. Camille accused him of cowardice, of using faith as an excuse for fear. The words became weapons, each strike more vicious than the last, inflicting wounds that would never fully heal. Rohan Desai, meanwhile, was growing impatient for an answer. At the urging of his sisters, he decided to force the issue. He would go to the Laurent home that evening, speak to Camille's mother, and establish a firm timeline for her decision. Camille's mother was delighted by Rohan's assertiveness. She took it upon herself to prepare Camille for his visit, laying out a beautiful silk saree, insisting her daughter dress appropriately for what was essentially a pre-engagement discussion. Camille returned from her devastating confrontation with Gabriel to find her mother and Rohan in the sitting room. Tea and sweet bebinka already served, the atmosphere thick with expectation. She stood in the doorway in her simple white kurta, her eyes still red from crying, and felt the trap closing completely. Her mother's expression shifted from pleasure to concern to barely concealed anger. Rohan, perceptive despite his businessman's pragmatism, sensed immediately that something was very wrong. He suggested they postpone the conversation, but Madeleine would not be deterred. She insisted Camille sit, compose herself, and address Rohan's very reasonable request for clarity. What happened next would be recounted in whispers for years afterward. Camille looked at Rohan, this kind man who represented everything her community valued, and she couldn't do it. Couldn't pretend anymore, couldn't perform dutiful gratitude, couldn't sentence herself to another loveless marriage. In a voice that started calm but grew increasingly unhinged, she told him the truth. She couldn't marry him because she was in love with someone else, had been seeing someone else, had already given herself to someone else completely. The silence that followed was absolute. Rohan's face drained of color. Madeleine stood frozen, her teacup trembling. Adele and Jeanne, upstairs doing homework, crept to the landing, drawn by the terrible quality of their mother's voice. And Camille, having finally spoken the truth out loud, felt something break loose inside her, a dam giving way. Her mother found her voice first, demanding to know who, when, how long. Camille, beyond caring now about consequences, said his name, Father Gabriel Moreau. She loved him, and he loved her, and they had been planning to leave together until his conscience destroyed what little chance they had. Rohan left without another word. Madeleine began to wail, a keening sound that brought neighbors to their gates. Adele started crying, her guilt overwhelming, and Jean finally understood that her family was disintegrating, that nothing would ever be the same. Madeleine, once past initial shock, became coldly furious. She would not allow her daughter to destroy the family reputation completely. She made phone calls, first to Father Joseph, then to the bishop's office, demanding that Gabriel be removed from Panjim immediately. She called her brother, a lawyer well connected in church and civil circles, and asked him to come immediately. Gabriel received an urgent message from Father Joseph. The situation had exploded. Camille had confessed everything to her family in front of Rohan. The entire community would know by morning. The bishop wanted Gabriel at the diocesan office immediately. In the chaos of that evening, one crucial fact was overlooked. Rohan had not gone home after leaving the Laurent house. Humiliated and furious, he wanted answers, wanted to understand how he had been so thoroughly deceived. He drove to the rectory with the intention of confronting Gabriel man to man. Rohan arrived at the rectory at the same moment Camille did. She had fled her house while her mother was on the phone, unable to bear the recriminations and her daughter's tears. She had gone to Gabriel, needing to see him one final time, needing to tell him that she had burned everything down, that there was nothing left to protect now. The three of them converged in the rectory study at 9:30 on a Thursday evening in late July. Gabriel looked up to see both Camille and Rohan entering the room. The expression on his face was one of complete despair. Rohan spoke first, his voice tight with controlled fury. He wanted to understand what kind of man seduced a grieving widow, what kind of priest violated not just his vows, but the trust of an entire community. Gabriel had no defense to offer. He could only apologize, inadequate as it was, and assure Rohan that Camille was blameless, that he had manipulated her vulnerability. But Camille rejected this narrative. She wasn't some innocent victim seduced by a predatory priest. She had wanted this, had chosen it, had pursued it as actively as Gabriel had. She was tired of men deciding her fate, her mother planning her life, Rohan expecting her gratitude, Gabriel trying to protect her by leaving. She was a woman with agency and desire, and the right to make her own choices, even destructive ones. The argument intensified, three people caught in an impossible situation. Rohan's hurt transformed into rage. Gabriel's guilt transformed into defensive anger. Camille's desperation transformed into something wild and reckless. Voices rose, accusations flew, and in the overheated emotional atmosphere, reason evaporated completely. What happened next was never entirely clear in anyone's memory afterward. Rohan moved toward Gabriel, whether to strike him or simply to intimidate. No one could say. Gabriel raised his hands, defensively or aggressively. Accounts would differ. Camille stepped between them, trying to separate the men. There was a struggle, brief but violent. Rohan stumbled backward, striking his head on the corner of the heavy wooden desk. The sound of impact was sickening, unmistakable. He dropped to the floor and lay completely still. For a frozen moment, neither Camille nor Gabriel moved. Then they rushed to Rohan, Gabriel checking for a pulse with shaking hands, Camille calling his name with increasing panic. But there was no response, no breath, no heartbeat. Blood pooled slowly beneath Rohan's head, dark against the worn rectory carpet. Gabriel and Camille looked at each other across Rohan's body, both their faces pale with shock and horror. They had crossed every line, broken every rule, and now there was blood on their hands. In that moment, they faced a choice that would define the rest of their lives. They could call for help immediately, tell the truth, face whatever consequences came. Or they could try to protect themselves, to hide what had happened, to add one final terrible sin to all the others they had already committed. Fear, as it so often does, won. The decision to hide Rohan's body was made in seconds, but would haunt them forever. Gabriel's mind, trained in theology, suddenly operated with cold, pragmatic logic. The rectory was old, built with thick walls and minimal windows facing the street. No one had seen Rohan arrive. His car was parked behind the building, obscured from view. If they acted quickly, they could make this disappear. Camille stood frozen, staring at Rohan's body, at the blood seeping into the carpet. This man had been alive minutes ago, planning a future with her, had done nothing wrong. Now he was dead, and they were discussing how to hide him like an inconvenient problem rather than a human being. But fear was a powerful anesthetic to conscience. Gabriel checked the rectory to ensure they were alone. Father Joseph had gone to visit a sick parishioner. The housekeeper had left hours ago. They had a narrow window of time. He began giving instructions, his voice low and urgent. They needed to wrap the body, move it to his car, drive somewhere remote. They wrapped Rohan in the blood-soaked carpet, then in plastic sheeting from the storage room. The physical labor was grotesque, his body heavy and awkward, his head lolling at an unnatural angle. Camille vomited twice, once in the study and once while carrying him to Gabriel's old Maruti sedan. They drove in silence toward the Bhagwan Mahavir Wildlife Sanctuary, an hour inland where coastal plains gave way to forested mountains. Gabriel knew the area from seminary hiking trips, knew there were logging roads that saw little traffic, especially at night. The drive felt endless, every passing vehicle a potential witness, every checkpoint they passed without incident, a small miracle. They found a ravine off an abandoned logging road, so overgrown it was barely visible. Using a shovel from the rectory, they took turns digging in the rocky soil. Mosquitoes swarmed them. The humid night air made breathing difficult. Camille's expensive silk kurta was filthy with mud and worse. They dug for 3 hours, creating a grave barely deep enough, and lowered Rohan's wrapped body into it. Gabriel said prayers over the grave, the irony profound and absurd. He was burying a man they had killed, asking God's mercy while compounding their sins. Camille couldn't listen. She stood apart, staring at nothing, her mind refusing to process what her hands had done. They covered the grave, scattered leaves and branches, and drove back to Panjim as dawn broke over the Arabian Sea. The investigation began 3 days later, when Rohan's sisters reported him missing. His car was found abandoned behind Our Lady of Immaculate Conception Church, keys still in the ignition. The discovery sent shockwaves through Panjim's Catholic community, already reeling from rumors about Camille Laurent and Father Gabriel. Inspector Arjun Rao was assigned to the case, a methodical officer who had built his reputation on patient accumulation of detail. He began with Rohan's movements on his last known day, interviewing everyone. The trail led quickly to the Laurent house, to the dinner meeting, to the dramatic revelation that had sent Rohan fleeing. Camille was questioned first, in her home with her mother present. She told a version of the truth that Rohan had come to discuss marriage, that she had confessed to being involved with someone else, that he had left upset but alive. Inspector Rao noted her evasiveness, the trembling hands, the dark circles suggesting sleepless nights. Gabriel was questioned at the rectory with Father Joseph present. He admitted to counseling Camille, acknowledged their relationship had become inappropriate, expressed deep regret, but he claimed no knowledge of Rohan, had never met the man. Inspector Rao noticed the missing carpet from the study, the faint smell of cleaning chemicals, the discoloration where something had been scrubbed. Forensic examination revealed traces of blood in the study. Rohan's phone records showed his last location as the rectory area. Gabriel's car had traces of soil consistent with laterite found in the Western Ghats. None of this was conclusive, but together it painted a disturbing picture. Camille's psychological deterioration was rapid. She stopped eating, barely slept. She would wake from nightmares seeing Rohan's face, hearing the sound of impact, feeling the weight of his body. Gabriel fared no better. His hands shook during communion. His sermons became disjointed, focusing obsessively on sin and the impossibility of redemption. He lost weight, moved through the parish like a ghost. 6 weeks after Rohan's disappearance, tourists hiking in the wildlife sanctuary reported a foul smell from an overgrown ravine. Forest officials found what remained of Rohan Desai's body, identifiable through dental records. The autopsy confirmed blunt force trauma to the head as cause of death. The arrests came swiftly. Inspector Rao arrived at the Laurent house at dawn with a warrant. Camille was taken into custody while her daughters watched, Madeleine's wailing audible throughout the neighborhood. Gabriel was arrested simultaneously at the rectory. The charges were murder, criminal conspiracy, and destruction of evidence. Gabriel's confession came on the 3rd day of interrogation. He couldn't bear the weight anymore, the lies, the knowledge of what they had done. In a small room at the Panjim police station, Gabriel told Inspector Rao everything: the affair, the confrontation, the accident, the panicked decision, the burial. He insisted Rohan's death was accidental, that everything afterward was born of fear and terrible judgment. Camille initially maintained her innocence, but when informed that Gabriel had confessed, she broke completely. She confirmed Gabriel's account, adding details he had omitted. She described the sound of impact, the feel of Rohan's absent pulse, the taste of fear as they dug. She cried while giving her statement, not for herself, but for Rohan, for his sisters, for the life they had stolen. The media descended on Panjim like locusts: Catholic priest and widow in illicit affair, accidental death, elaborate cover-up. It had every element necessary for maximum coverage. The parish was devastated. Church attendance dropped by half as Catholics questioned whether their faith community could survive such corruption. The trial began 8 months later in the Goa District Court. The prosecution argued for murder, claiming the confrontation was premeditated. The defense argued for culpable homicide not amounting to murder, emphasizing the accidental nature and genuine remorse. The courtroom was packed daily. Camille's daughters attended every session, Adele openly weeping, Jeanne's face a mask of devastation. Gabrielle's elderly mother came from Kerala, her presence a silent condemnation. Rohan's sisters sat in the front row, their grief palpable, demanding justice. The verdict came after 3 months of testimony. The court found both guilty of culpable homicide not amounting to murder, accepting that Rohan's death had been accidental, but holding them fully responsible for the cover-up. Gabrielle was sentenced to 14 years imprisonment. Camille received 12 years, the court showing minimal leniency for her status as a mother. The sentencing hearing revealed the true cost. Adele gave a victim impact statement describing the loss of both parents, the burden of guilt she carried, the way her faith had been destroyed. Jean spoke of abandoning university plans to support her sister, of the stigma they would carry forever. Rohan's sister described her brother's kindness, his undeserved death, the final disrespect of treating his body like garbage. Gabriel wept throughout the hearing, his face haggard. Camille sat in silence, her expression empty, as if she had retreated so far inside herself that she was no longer present. When asked if she had anything to say, she spoke only 5 words. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." But sorry could not resurrect the dead or undo the destruction their choices had caused. As they were led from the courtroom to begin their sentences, both understood with absolute clarity that they had traded momentary passion for permanent devastation, that the connection they had thought worth any cost had ultimately cost them everything, including their souls. 4 years into her sentence, Camille Laurent exists in a state of perpetual penance that no priest could absolve. She resides in the Vasco da Gama Women's Correctional Facility, a crumbling Portuguese-era building where monsoon rains leak through cracks and summer heat becomes unbearable. She shares a cell with 3 other women and has learned to move through prison life with the same careful propriety she once brought to parish functions. Her daughters visit monthly, though the visits have become increasingly strained. Adele, now 20, works as a teacher's aide in Margao, far enough from Panjim that her family name doesn't immediately trigger recognition. She has changed her surname to her grandmother's maiden name, severing the visible connection to the Laurent legacy. During visits, she speaks to her mother with careful politeness, discussing weather and work, avoiding anything of substance. The guilt that drove her to Father Joseph 4 years ago has calcified into resentment she cannot fully express. Jean visits less frequently. She managed to salvage her education, attending university in Bangalore on scholarship, studying law with grim determination. She tells her mother about coursework and internships, but never about her personal life, never about the boyfriend she's been seeing, never about her plans. Camille is being kept informed, but not included, a distinction that hurts more than overt rejection. Madeleine Laurent died 18 months after her daughter's conviction. A stroke, the doctors said, was natural, but everyone understood was grief-induced. She never forgave Camille, never visited the prison, spent her final months refusing to speak her daughter's name. At the funeral, which Camille was not permitted to attend, Father Joseph gave a eulogy that carefully avoided mentioning Madeleine's daughter. The absence was noted by everyone present. Gabriel serves his sentence in Aguada Central Jail, a maximum security facility built inside the old Portuguese fort overlooking the Arabian Sea. He has been defrocked, officially laicized by the Vatican in proceedings he did not contest. The priesthood that defined his identity for 25 years has been stripped away, leaving him simply Gabriel Moreau, prisoner number 4782, a man without vocation or purpose. He works in the prison library, organizing books and helping semi-literate inmates, finding in this small service some echo of his former calling. He and Camille have had no contact since their arrest. Prison regulations prohibit communication between co-defendants, and after sentencing, neither has attempted to reach out. What words could possibly bridge the chasm of what they did? The passion that once seemed worth any cost now feels like temporary insanity, a madness they shared that led inevitably to devastation. Gabriel's mother visits him quarterly, making the long journey from Kerala despite her advanced age and failing health. She sits across from him in the visiting room and prays, rosary beads moving through her fingers. She has forgiven him, she tells him, because that is what her faith demands. But forgiveness and restoration are not the same thing. He will always be her son, but he will never again be the priest she was so proud of. That Gabriel is dead, killed in a rectory study one July evening along with Rohan Desai. The parish of Our Lady of Immaculate Conception has slowly recovered, though the scars remain visible. A new priest, Father Manuel, was installed 6 months after Gabriel's arrest, an older man nearing retirement who volunteered for what everyone knew was a difficult assignment. He preached consistently about mercy and redemption, about the church as a hospital for sinners rather than a museum for saints. Attendance gradually increased, though some families never returned, their faith too damaged by the revelation that their spiritual shepherd could be capable of such profound betrayal. The church garden, where Camille and Gabriel first crossed invisible lines, has been redesigned, the frangipani trees cut down and replaced with a prayer grotto featuring a statue of Mary. No one mentions why the change was made, but everyone understands. Some spaces become too haunted by their histories to remain unchanged. Rohan Desai's sisters established a foundation in his name that provides support for victims of clerical abuse, interpreting their brother's death broadly as resulting from abuse of spiritual authority. They pushed for policy changes in the archdiocese, requiring clearer boundaries in pastoral counseling, mandatory supervision for priests working with vulnerable parishioners, and stronger accountability measures. The reforms were implemented quietly. In prison, Camille has become Catholic again in a way she never was during her years of performative piety. She attends Mass daily, not because the community expects it, but because she needs it, needs the ritual and structure, needs to kneel before something larger than herself and her massive failures. She takes communion from a visiting priest who doesn't know her story, and the taste is both familiar and completely different. She is no longer receiving it as a good Catholic woman, but as someone who has fallen as far as possible and is trying to find some path back. She writes letters to Rohan's sisters that she never sends, attempting to explain, to apologize, to make them understand. But there are no words adequate to the task. How do you apologize for participating in the death and burial of someone's beloved brother? The letters pile up in her cell, pages of inadequate attempts at contrition. Gabriel has stopped writing entirely. For the first year, he kept a journal, trying to process what had happened, trying to understand how he had strayed so catastrophically. But eventually, he realized that understanding wasn't the point. He knew exactly how it happened, could trace every decision, every small compromise. The knowledge didn't help. It just made the weight heavier. He dreams of Rohan sometimes, sees him standing in the rectory study, head intact, very much alive, asking Gabriel questions about faith and whether priests really give up everything for their calling. In the dreams, Gabriel tries to apologize, but Rohan isn't interested in apologies. He just wants to understand what his death was for, what meaning can be extracted from the waste of his life. Gabriel wakes from these dreams, unable to answer. The question of whether justice has been served depends on who is asked. Rohan's family feels the sentences were too lenient, that 14 and 12 years cannot possibly equal a life stolen. The defense attorneys argued their clients had already lost everything and posed no danger to society. The judge attempted to balance accountability with mercy, punishment with recognition that 2 more lives destroyed wouldn't resurrect the one already lost. Adele has started attending therapy, finally addressing the trauma of that night when she found her mother's secret phone and made the decision to tell Father Joseph. Her therapist keeps asking if she feels responsible for what happened. Adele keeps insisting she doesn't, but they both know that's not entirely true. If she had confronted her mother directly, if she had told a friend, if she had done nothing at all, would Rohan Desai still be alive? Jeanne has decided she wants to practice criminal defense law, representing people accused of crimes who may or may not be guilty. Her professors tell her she has a gift for seeing complexity in situations others view as black and white. She doesn't tell them where this gift came from, doesn't explain that she learned it by watching her mother transform from pillar of the community to convicted criminal. As Camille's sentence progresses toward its eventual conclusion, she thinks often about what comes after. In 8 more years, she will be released at 54, but returning to a world where her name is synonymous with scandal. Her daughters will be adults with their own lives. Her mother is dead. Her community has moved on. The house where she raised her family was sold to pay legal fees, the physical spaces of her former life erased. Gabriel's release is farther away, but he thinks about it less. He has no expectation of rebuilding anything resembling a normal life. The priesthood was his identity, his purpose, his structure for understanding the world. Without it, he is unmoored, fundamentally unclear about who he is or what he's for. He suspects he will live out his days in some anonymous location, taking whatever menial work he can find, trying to do enough good to balance however minutely against the enormous harm he caused. The affair lasted 6 months. The cover-up lasted 6 weeks. The consequences will last the rest of their lives and ripple forward into futures they will never see, affecting their children, the families they destroyed, the community they betrayed. This is not a story about love conquering all or passion justifying any cost. This is a story about how human desire, when unchecked by wisdom and compassion, becomes destructive. About how small compromises accumulate into catastrophic failures. About how the people we hurt most are often those who loved or trusted us. About how attempting to escape consequences only creates worse consequences. Rohan Desai is still dead. That fact is immutable, unchangeable, the fixed point around which all other suffering revolves. A man who wanted only to build a life with someone he thought could love him ended up buried in a forest grave by the 2 people responsible for his death. No amount of imprisonment, no depth of remorse, no passage of time can alter that fundamental injustice. 4 years in, with so many more still ahead, Camille and Gabriel live with that knowledge every day. It is their penance, their punishment, and their truth. They made choices, terrible choices, and those choices had consequences. They destroyed lives, including their own. They broke sacred trusts and violated basic human decency, and they will answer for it for the rest of their lives. Some secrets once revealed destroy everything they touch. Some passions, once indulged, consume everything around them. Some choices once made can never be unmade. The truth always surfaces. The cost is always higher than imagined, and some prices once paid can never buy back what was lost.